The thunder of hooves against the hard, packed earth announced Zachariah Zimmer's arrival long before his silhouette appeared on the horizon of Sweetwater, Texas. The year was 1885, and like the rolling storm clouds gathering in the distance, the past was about to catch up with him in ways he never expected. Zach dismounted his chestnut stallion outside the saloon, dust settling around his worn leather boots. At 32, the years of ranch work had hardened his frame and weathered his once boyish features. His hands, calloused from roping cattle and mending fences, pushed through his dark hair as he surveyed the town he'd called home for the past 5 years. Mr. Zimmer called out the young telegraph operator racing down the boardwalk with a yellow paper fluttering in his hand. "Telegram came for you, sir, marked urgent." Zach's brow furrowed as he accepted the message, tipping his hat in thanks. His eyes scanned the brief words, and the color drained from his sun-bronzed face. "Coming to Sweetwater. Need to see you. Faith Anderson," a name he hadn't allowed himself to speak aloud in nearly a decade. The woman who had once been his everything until circumstances beyond their control had torn them apart. His first love. His only love, if he was being honest with himself. Zach folded the telegram carefully, tucking it into his vest pocket close to his heart. The same place where Faith had resided all these years, despite his best efforts to forget her. 3 days later, the afternoon stagecoach rolled into town, kicking up clouds of dust that swirled in the golden Texas sunlight. Zach stood rigid beside the hitching post, hat in hand, his heart hammering against his ribs with each turn of the wheels. When the coach door swung open, time seemed to slow. First came a small, worn leather boot, then the hem of a dusty blue traveling dress. And then Faith. Her honey blonde hair was pinned beneath a modest hat, a few wayward strands framing a face that had haunted his dreams for years. She stepped down carefully, her eyes scanning the small crowd until they locked with his. Even across the distance, he could see they were filled with tears. Zach's boots felt rooted to the ground as Faith made her way toward him, each step seemingly more difficult than the last. When she finally stood before him, her lower lip trembled and tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "Zach," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. Without a word, he gently lifted her chin with his finger, tilting her face up to his. The years had changed them both, but in her eyes, he still saw the girl who had promised to love him forever beneath the old oak tree on her father's property. "You're still mine," Zach whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Always have been." Faith's breath caught as fresh tears welled in her eyes. Before she could respond, Zach wrapped his arms around her, drawing her close as if to protect her from whatever had brought her back to him in such a state. "I never stopped loving you," she confessed against his chest, her words muffled by emotion and the fabric of his shirt. "Not for a single day." Zach held her tighter, breathing in the familiar scent of her that somehow remained unchanged by time. "Let's get you somewhere quiet," he murmured, aware of the curious glances from townsfolk. "We have a lot to talk about." He led her to his horse, helping her up before mounting behind her. They rode in silence through town and beyond, to the small ranch he'd built with his own hands over the years. It wasn't grand, but it was a dream he'd once shared with Faith, never truly believing it would come to pass with her by his side. Inside his modest home, Faith removed her hat and gloves, her eyes taking in the simple but comfortable furnishings. A kettle hung over the fireplace, and Zach busied himself preparing coffee, giving her time to collect herself. "You've done well for yourself," Faith observed, running her fingertips along the back of a hand-carved chair. "It's not much, but it's mine," Zach replied, placing 2 steaming cups on the table. "Free and clear," Faith smiled sadly. "I always knew you would. You were always so determined." They sat across from each other, the weight of unasked questions hanging between them. Zach waited, knowing she would speak when ready. "Henry died," Faith finally said, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. 3 months ago, influenza." Zach nodded slowly. "Henry Anderson, Faith's husband. The man her father had chosen for her, the wealthy cattle baron's son who could provide what a poor ranch hand like Zach couldn't." The man she'd married while Zach was away trying to make his fortune, determined to return worthy of asking for her hand. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said sincerely. Faith shook her head. We weren't. She took a deep breath. "It was never a love match, Zach, you know that. Father arranged it while you were gone. When your letters stopped coming, I thought my letters stopped." Zach's voice was sharp with surprise. "Faith, I wrote to you every week for over a year." Her eyes widened. "I received 3 letters, then nothing. Father said you'd found opportunity elsewhere, that you weren't coming back." Zach's jaw tightened. "George Anderson," he muttered, understanding dawning. "He made sure you never got my letters. And when word came that you'd returned but left again without seeing me," Faith's voice trailed off. "I came back to find you married," Zach said, the old pain evident in his voice. "I couldn't bear to stay to see you with him." Faith closed her eyes, years of misunderstanding washing over her face. "I thought you'd abandoned what we had." "Never," Zach said firmly. "Not for one moment." A silence fell between them, filled with lost years and missed chances. "Why did you come here, Faith?" Zach finally asked, though part of him feared the answer. She met his eyes directly. "Because I have nowhere else to go. Henry's family, they never accepted me. When he died, they made it clear I wasn't welcome. The estate went to his brother." Zach's heart clenched at the thought of her alone and vulnerable. "You have me," he said without hesitation. "You've always had me." Fresh tears welled in Faith's eyes. "After everything, after all this time," Zach reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "Time hasn't changed how I feel." "It never could," but Faith pulled her hands away gently. "We can't simply pick up where we left off, Zach. Too much has happened." "Then we start fresh," he countered. "One day at a time." Faith stood, moving to the window where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land. "I need time," she said softly, "to grieve, to understand what happened, to find my footing again." Zach nodded, though she couldn't see him. "You can stay in the spare room as long as you need. No expectations." She turned, gratitude softening her features. "Thank you." That night, as Zach lay awake listening to the distant coyotes, he marveled at how life could change in an instant. Faith was under his roof, not as he'd dreamed all these years, but she was here. And for now, that was enough. The following days established a cautious routine. Faith took over the cooking, her skilled hands bringing new life to Zach's simple meals. He showed her the ranch, introducing her to the small herd of cattle he was building and the 2 ranch hands who helped him, Miguel and old Tom. Faith seemed to bloom in the open air, color returning to her cheeks as she shed the formal constraints of her life as Henry Anderson's wife. She traded her fine dresses for simpler attire, and Zach found himself captivated by her easy grace, just as he had been when they were young. A week into her stay, Zach returned from checking fence lines to find Faith in the barn, gently brushing his mare. Her sleeves were rolled up, and wisps of hair had escaped her braid. She looked more beautiful to him than she ever had in fancy dresses. "You haven't lost your touch with horses," he observed, leaning against the stall door. Faith smiled. "Some things you don't forget." She paused, her expression growing wistful. "Remember how we used to ride out to Willow Creek, race each other to the Big Bend?" "And you'd always win," Zach chuckled, "because I'd let you." "You did not," Faith protested, her eyes lighting up with the old spark. "Peaches was faster than thunder, and you know it." "If that helps you sleep at night," he teased, and for a moment it was as if the years between them dissolved. Faith's laughter faded into a soft smile. "I've missed this, missed you." Before Zach could respond, Miguel appeared at the barn entrance. "Senor Zimmer, riders coming. Looks like the Hawkins boys." Zach's expression darkened. The Hawkins brothers had been trying to push him off his land since he'd settled there, convinced the water rights should be theirs. "Stay here," he told Faith, his hand instinctively checking for the revolver at his hip. "Zach," Faith's voice held concern. "It'll be fine," he assured her, though his tight smile betrayed his worry. "Just business." Outside, 3 riders approached, dust billowing behind them. Zach stood on his porch, arms crossed, as the men drew up their horses. "Zimmer," the eldest Hawkins brother, Jed, acknowledged with a curt nod. "Heard you got company." "My business is my own, Hawkins," Zach replied evenly. Word travels, Jed's younger brother Cal remarked with a smirk. Widow Anderson, ain't it? Henry Anderson's wife from up Laramie Way. Zach's jaw tightened. State your business or move on, Jed dismounted, his spurs jangling as he approached the porch. Same offer as before, my land adjoins yours to the north. Combined, we'd have the best grazing and water access in the county. And I've given you my answer before. This land isn't for sale. Things change, Jed said, his eyes drifting toward the house. Man's circumstances shift, especially when he's got a woman to consider. Zach stepped forward, his hand hovering near his gun. You do well to leave Faith out of this. Jed raised his hands in mock surrender. Just making conversation, but think on it, Zimmer. My offer won't stay open forever. He turned to leave, then added, give Mrs. Anderson my regards. As the Hawkins brothers rode away, Zach remained on the porch, his unease growing. Something in Jed's tone suggested he knew more than he should. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Zach filled Faith in on the Hawkins brothers' long-standing attempts to acquire his land. They've been after this property since I bought it, he explained. Their ranch is bigger, but I've got the better water source. In these parts, that's worth more than gold. Faith's brow furrowed. They seem to know who I am. News travels fast in small towns, Zach said, though he shared her concern, but something doesn't sit right. Faith hesitated, then spoke. There's something I haven't told you, Zach, about why I really came here. Zach turned to her, his expression serious. Before Henry died, he discovered something, papers in his father's study. Faith took a deep breath. It seems the Anderson and Hawkins families have been in business together for years, and not just cattle. What kind of business? Land acquisition, by any means necessary. Faith's voice trembled slightly. Henry confronted his father about it. 2 weeks later, he was dead. Zach sat up straighter. You think his death wasn't natural? I don't know, Faith admitted. But after the funeral, I found men searching our home. When I confronted them, they claimed to be looking for documents Henry had taken. And you think these documents implicated the Hawkins family? Faith nodded. Henry had hidden them. He told me if anything happened to him, I should find you. That you were the only one he trusted to make things right. Zach stared at her, processing this revelation. Henry knew about us. He knew I never stopped loving you, Faith said softly. Our marriage was one of convenience, arranged by our fathers, but over time we became friends. He was a good man, Zach. He didn't deserve what happened to him. Zach ran a hand through his hair, pieces falling into place. So the Hawkins brothers showing up today wasn't coincidence. They think you brought these documents to me. I did, Faith confirmed. They're in my trunk. Henry believed they proved the Hawkins and Anderson families have been forcing people off their land for years, forging deeds, even arranging accidents for those who wouldn't sell. Including my father, Zach said, a cold realization washing over him. James Zimmer's death in a supposed riding accident had never sat right with Zach. It had happened shortly after he'd refused to sell their small ranch, the very land Zach now owned. Faith reached for his hand. I'm sorry. I didn't know it would put you in danger. I just didn't know where else to go. Zach squeezed her fingers. You came to exactly the right place. We'll figure this out together. That night, they pored over the documents Henry had collected. Dates, properties, names of families who had been driven out or suffered suspicious accidents. The pattern was unmistakable. And there, in black and white, was evidence suggesting James Zimmer's death had been orchestrated by George Anderson and Vernon Hawkins. This is enough to bring to the sheriff, Zach said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Faith looked uncertain. Sheriff Daniels, can he be trusted? Tom Daniels is a good man, Zach assured her. He stood up to the Hawkins brothers before. A plan formed. They would ride into town the next day, present the evidence to Sheriff Daniels, and let justice take its course. But as they prepared for bed, an unspoken tension lingered between them, a realization that danger might be closer than they thought. Zach, Faith said softly from the doorway of the spare room. Be careful, he nodded, fighting the urge to pull her into his arms. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day. They were awakened before dawn by the smell of smoke. Zach burst from his room to find the front of the house already ablaze, flames licking up the walls and across the ceiling. "Faith," he shouted, rushing to her door and throwing it open. She was already up, clutching the packet of documents to her chest. "We need to get out," Zach yelled over the roar of the fire. Back door, they made their way through the thickening smoke, keeping low. Outside, the sound of gunshots cracked through the pre-dawn darkness. "Get to the barn," Zach ordered, drawing his revolver. "Saddle the horses." Faith hesitated. "What about you? I'll cover you." "Go." As Faith dashed toward the barn, Zach positioned himself behind a water trough, scanning the darkness. A muzzle flash from near the corral gave away one attacker's position, and Zach returned fire. Miguel appeared from the bunkhouse, rifle in hand. "East side, patron," he called, indicating another assailant. Between them, they managed to drive the attackers back long enough for Faith to emerge from the barn with 2 saddled horses. The main house was fully engulfed now, flames shooting high into the night sky. "We need to ride," Zach said grimly, helping Faith mount. "Miguel, get Tom and head for town. Tell Sheriff Daniels what's happened." "See, patron, be careful." Zach and Faith galloped away from the burning ranch, taking a route through the hills rather than the main road. Behind them, more shots rang out, but distance quickly put them beyond range. "Where are we going?" Faith called as they rode hard through the darkness. "The old mining cabin," Zach shouted back. "Up in Fuller's Ridge. No one knows about it but me." They rode for nearly 2 hours, following game trails and dry creek beds to mask their trail. The sky was lightening to a pale gray by the time they reached the abandoned cabin, nestled among pine trees high in the rocky hills. Inside, the single room was dusty but intact. A stone fireplace, rough-hewn table and chairs, and a narrow bed were the only furnishings. Zach secured the horses in a small lean-to behind the cabin, then checked their surroundings carefully before joining Faith inside. "We should be safe here for now," he said, setting down his saddlebags. "No one's used this place in years." Faith was shaking, the events of the night catching up with her. "They burned your home, Zach, because of me." "Because of them," he corrected firmly. "Houses can be rebuilt." He built a small fire, careful to use dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. As warmth filled the cabin, Faith gradually calmed, though her eyes remained haunted. "I never should have come to you," she whispered. "I've brought nothing but trouble." Zach knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his. "Listen to me. You came because you trusted me, because Henry trusted me. And because deep down you knew what I've known all along, that we belong together." Tears welled in Faith's eyes. "I've lost everything, Zach, my home, my security, and now yours too." "You haven't lost me," he said firmly, "and you never will again." In the quiet that followed, something shifted between them. Faith's eyes, still bright with tears, held a warmth that had been absent since her arrival. Slowly, hesitantly, she leaned forward until her forehead rested against his. "I was so afraid you'd send me away," she admitted. "That you'd hate me for marrying Henry." "I could never hate you," Zach murmured. "I tried to forget you, tried to convince myself I didn't love you anymore, but seeing you again." He drew back slightly to look into her eyes. It was like no time had passed at all. Faith's hand came up to cup his cheek. "I've dreamed of this," she whispered, "of being with you again, even when I thought it was impossible." Their lips met in a kiss that began tender but quickly deepened with years of longing. When they finally drew apart, both were breathless. "We should rest," Zach said reluctantly. "We'll need to move again by nightfall." They took turns sleeping, one always keeping watch. By late afternoon, they had formulated a plan. They would wait until dark, then make their way to town by a roundabout route, hopefully reaching Sheriff Daniels before the Hawkins brothers realized where they'd gone. As dusk approached, they prepared to leave. Zach checked his revolver one last time before holstering it. "Ready?" He asked Faith, who nodded, the documents securely hidden in her bodice. They had just stepped outside when the sound of approaching horses reached them. Zach pushed Faith back into the cabin, drawing his gun. "Stay inside," he ordered, positioning himself beside the door. But instead of the Hawkins brothers, it was Sheriff Daniels who appeared in the clearing, accompanied by Miguel and 2 deputies. "Zimmer," the sheriff called. "You in there? It's Tom Daniels." Zach stepped cautiously into view, his gun still ready. "Sheriff, how'd you find us?" "Your man Miguel had a fair idea where you might head," Daniels explained, dismounting. "Good thing, too, the Hawkins boys have half the county looking for you." "They tried to kill us," Faith said, emerging from the cabin. "They burned Zach's home." Sheriff Daniels nodded grimly. "I know. We found the evidence you left with your ranch hand. Quite a story it tells." He gestured to the packet Faith still clutched. "Is that the rest?" Faith looked to Zach, who nodded. She handed the documents to the sheriff. "Vernon Hawkins is in custody," Daniels continued as he leafed through the papers. "His sons are still at large, but we've got men looking. This," he tapped the documents, "is enough to put them away for a long time." "And George Anderson?" Faith asked quietly. "Already sent a telegram to the sheriff in Laramie. They'll be paying him a visit." Daniels looked up at Faith with sympathy. "Sorry about your husband, madam. Sounds like he was a good man in the end." "He was," Faith agreed softly. The ride back to town was tense but uneventful. Sheriff Daniels placed them in a room above the general store, with deputies posted outside. The town was buzzing with the news of the Hawkins family's crimes and the dramatic fire at Zach's ranch. "What happens now?" Faith asked as they sat in the small room that evening. "We rebuild," Zach said simply. "The house is gone, but the land is still there. The cattle survived." He took her hand. "That is, if you're staying." Faith's eyes met his. "Is that what you want?" Zach brought her hand to his lips. "I want what I've always wanted, a life with you, Faith. A family, everything we dreamed of under that old oak tree." Faith's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Then yes, Zach, I'm staying." 2 days later, word came that Jed and Cal Hawkins had been captured trying to cross into New Mexico territory. With their father already behind bars and facing murder charges, the threat was finally over. The town of Sweetwater rallied around Zach and Faith. A barn raising was organized to help rebuild the house, and though it would take time, the foundations were laid within a week. In the meantime, they stayed in rooms above the mercantile, adjusting to their new reality. One evening, as the sun set over the newly framed walls of their future home, Zach found Faith sitting on a stack of lumber, lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her. Faith smiled. "I was thinking about all the twists and turns that brought us here, how easy it would have been to never find our way back to each other." Zach nodded, understanding. Life has a way of coming full circle. "Do you think we would have found each other again if not for Henry's discovery?" "I like to think so," Zach said, taking her hand. "Some things are meant to be, no matter how long they take." Faith leaned her head on his shoulder. "I never stopped loving you, not for a single day." "And I never stopped waiting for you," Zach replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Even when I thought you were lost to me forever." As the last light faded from the sky, Zach reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. "I've been carrying this for a long time," he said, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold band. "I bought it before I left to make my fortune. I was going to ask you to marry me when I returned." Faith's breath caught. "Zach, I know it's soon," he said quickly. "And I understand if you need more time, but I've waited nearly 10 years to ask you this question, and I don't want to wait another day." He slid off the lumber, kneeling before her. "Faith Anderson, will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Faith's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Zach slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love that had sustained him through their years apart. 3 months later, they were married under the same oak tree where they had first pledged their love as teenagers. The new house stood completed on Zach's land, and the future stretched before them, bright with promise. "Mrs. Zimmer," Zach whispered as they danced at their wedding celebration, surrounded by friends who had helped them rebuild. "Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" Faith's eyes sparkled with happiness. "I've waited a lifetime to hear it." "Well, you'll be hearing it for the rest of our days," he promised. As the years passed, the Z Ranch prospered. Faith and Zach welcomed 2 children, a son named James, after Zach's father, and a daughter they called Hope, for what had sustained them through their years apart. The story of their reunion became something of a legend in Sweetwater. How Faith had returned to her first love with tears in her eyes and documents that brought down the corrupt Hawkins empire. How Zach had rebuilt his home and his life with the woman he had never stopped loving. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the Texas stars shone overhead, Zach and Faith would sit on their porch, hands intertwined, marveling at the journey that had brought them home to each other. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your father hadn't intercepted my letters?" Zach asked one such night, 20 years into their marriage. Faith considered this, her face still beautiful to him despite the lines that time had etched around her eyes. "I think we would have found our way here eventually," she said. "Different path, same destination." Zach nodded, lifting her hand to press a kiss to the gold band that had never left her finger. "You're still mine," he whispered, echoing the words he'd spoken when she'd returned to him in tears all those years ago. "Always," Faith replied, her voice soft with certainty. "In this life and whatever comes after." And in that moment, beneath the vast Texas sky that had witnessed their separation and reunion, their heartbreak and healing, Zach and Faith knew that some loves truly were destined to endure across time, distance, and even the greatest of obstacles. Theirs was such a love. Imperfect and hard-won but unbreakable. Forever,